Pride and Prejudice is a title that I'm pretty sure everyone has heard at one point or another. For myself, I knew that it was a novel written by Jane Austen and that it had been adapted several times. But until very recently, I didn't even know the plot of this story. So when I sat down to watch the 1995 miniseries, I went in completely blind, other than knowing it was one of the most popular British miniseries ever made. I watched it and enjoyed it immensely. And then I remembered I had the 1940 version kicking around somewhere, so I promptly had to watch that as well. So today I'm going to talk about both of these very different adaptations, what I liked, what I didn't like, and which one I enjoyed more. And keep in mind, I still have not read the novel, so my knowledge of this subject matter is based entirely on these two adaptations. If anyone is watching that was like me, here is a brief rundown of the plot. The story follows the 5 Bennet sisters and their various misadventures in love and society, and in particular centers around the relationship between Elizabeth Bennet and one Mr. Darcy, a very proud, very wealthy, and very eligible bachelor. The two adaptations are very different in terms of style. The 1940 film is a lavish MGM costume drama, or comedy, you could say, while the 1995 miniseries is a more grounded, probably more period-accurate interpretation of these events. Also, the miniseries is more of an ensemble piece, with a generally more serious, dramatic tone. The 1940 movie is definitely more of a star vehicle for Garson and Laurence Olivier, and overall is much lighter in tone. The miniseries does have plenty of humorous moments, but there are certain sections of the movie where they breeze over the implications a little more, especially concerning the Mr. Wickham storyline and all that would entail, where the miniseries really hones in on the social punishments and effects some of this would have had. And the runtimes contribute to the type of story that this can be as well. The movie has to tell this whole story in 2 hours, and does a pretty good job most of the time. It's a more breezy watch, but that results in some of the character relationships being more surface level. With the miniseries, though, you have nearly 6 hours in which to set up and slowly build many intricate relationships and subplots. The movie feels a lot more glossy, and you could really feel, with the sisters especially, that these are all supposed to be seen as glamorous women, even the bookworm Mary. What I appreciated about the miniseries is that these all look and feel like normal people, with a couple of exceptions. When a couple of the Bennet sisters are said to be more plain in comparison to Elizabeth or Jane, that's who was cast. And the same goes for the male characters. I am sure that Colin Firth's Mr. Darcy is seen as a heartthrob. I'm not sure how to judge that myself, but the men mostly don't seem like typical Hollywood leading man types. I have not seen the 2005 film yet, but I suspect that that one will lead more towards the glossy Hollywood-style romance, but we shall see. Getting away from that, what both have in common are incredible casts. Watching the miniseries first did have the effect of ingraining those takes on the characters as the definitive ones, because again, you have so much more time to get to know them and flesh out these characters. The character of Elizabeth is our main protagonist in both adaptations. Jennifer Ehle's performance in the miniseries is perfect. There is not a moment that fell out of character or not in keeping with the woman that Elizabeth is built up to be. She's very direct, very confident, but not afraid to admit when she was wrong. And she's able to play off the other characters excellently as well. She can be confiding and open with her elder sister Jane, patient around the increasing silliness that defines her younger sisters, and also very caring for her very irritating mother. And most importantly, her chemistry with Mr. Darcy is perfect at all points during the series. And as I mentioned, and everyone is aware, Colin Firth plays Mr. Darcy. This was very early in his career and propelled him into the spotlight for many viewers. He's great as well. Early on, since I've again not read the novel, his incessant brooding was almost comical to me. He shows up at these parties and balls and constantly is frowning and staring out windows as though he'd like to be anywhere else. Once we get farther into the series, it makes a lot more sense, and he has perfectly justified reasons for being as mistrustful as he is. He makes the most of the withering glances that he casts about and really portrays his conflicted feelings about Elizabeth very well. And I really enjoyed seeing the changes in his attitudes towards her. He has a harder job, I think, trying to pull off these changes by small degrees, where we don't really have the benefit of many of his private conversations or thoughts as we do with Elizabeth. In the 1940 film, Elizabeth is played by Greer Garson. She was the absolute highlight of the movie for me. She displays all of the traits that I think define the character of Elizabeth. She is a fair bit older than Jennifer Ehle was in the part, and likely older than the character of the book, but it only increased for me the idea of her being wise and confident and seemingly perfectly fine with never getting married if the right man doesn't come along. Greer Garson was billed first in the movie, and as I'd said, it feels like a star part where the focus is on her nearly at all times. This does result in key relationships with characters like Jane or her friend Charlotte feeling stunted, as we don't really get that much attention paid to them. This isn't really a criticism of Greer Garson though, more so the writing, since they're trying to fit in as much as possible into a 2-hour runtime. Laurence Olivier plays Mr. Darcy in the movie, and I have to admit, I wasn't all that keen on him. He's fine, but the brooding is toned way down, and he has to go through the changes in his character much quicker, so it feels a lot less natural. And I also didn't really feel the chemistry between him and Greer Garson, which is an important aspect, obviously. The writing and plot structure does do a disservice to the reasoning for Mr. Darcy getting a negative view of the Bennet family. In the miniseries, he's able to slowly watch their behavior over the course of many interactions and form his opinion. In the movie, though, most of it comes in one scene, where it seems that he and Elizabeth have hit it off, and then her sisters and mother promptly embarrass Elizabeth and scare off Mr. Darcy. Piling all of that into one sequence is too much, I think, and shows again why having more time to lay all this out is preferable. There is an added scene that I very much enjoyed in which Mr. Darcy condescendingly teaches Elizabeth how to use a bow and arrow, a skill that she already has. That was the best display of chemistry for these versions of the characters, and I thought it was a nice addition. For the rest of the Bennet sisters, Susanna Harker in the series is much better as Jane. She plays the much envied character very well, while never seeming to let that go to her head. On the contrary, she tries very hard to always see only the best in people. Her relationship with Elizabeth explores that so well, as Elizabeth is much more realistic and wishes she had the talent for looking past the bad that Jane has. Maureen O'Sullivan's Jane in 1940 isn't much of a character other than being the so-called prettiest one, but does what she can with the material. Julia Sawalha as Lydia is perfect casting, maybe too perfect. She's quite aggravating, overly flirtatious, and cluelessly cruel towards the end of the series. Anne Rutherford playing Lydia is also perfect casting, but in a different way. I have always enjoyed her as Andy Hardy's constantly on-again, off-again girlfriend Polly, and she's able to bring some of the same self-centered attitude that she often did as Polly Benedict. The other sisters I won't discuss in detail, other than to say that the portrayal of Mary is quite different in the two. In the film, Marcia Hunt is far more open to finding a husband while retaining her love of piano playing and singing, where Lucy Briars almost aggressively tries to make herself unappealing to men. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are two very important characters, and the casting is excellent in both cases. Benjamin Whitrow is amazing, to put it simply. He's hilarious and delivers his dry, cutting remarks towards his wife and daughters so easily. Every time he showed up in a scene, I loved it. And Edmund Gwenn in the film is the classic Hollywood version of that. They're given some of the exact same lines, so I'm guessing they're lifted directly from the novel, and he too is so funny in the role. The only problem is he's not on screen nearly enough. Alison Steadman as Mrs. Bennet, what can I say? She is one of the most irritating characters I've ever seen in any movie or series, but makes herself very memorable. She was one of those that I was referring to when I mentioned a couple notable exceptions to the normal people in the series. Her performance is very pronounced, almost overblown, but it doesn't feel out of place. How she and Mr. Bennet ended up married, I couldn't guess. They seem to have nothing whatsoever in common. After seeing her, Mary Boland in the movie is downright subtle. Okay, that's a stretch. Her character does force a carriage driver into a race against that of Mrs. Lucas's carriage, which is a very funny little action scene at the beginning of the movie. Another very caricatured person from the series is Mr. Collins, as played by David Bamber. His greasily separated locks of hair plastered to his forehead, his sleeves that are consistently too long, and creepy little waves he does are also strange, but again, I didn't mind. I mean, I minded the character being so odd, but it still worked. Melville Cooper in the same part is more stuffy and haughty, you could say, and leans more into being adult than a sniveling little whatever you want to say. There are plenty more characters you can discuss, but I'll cut it off there for time's sake. The locations for the miniseries are beautiful, in particular Pemberley and its grounds. These huge expanses of lawn, the many rooms in this massive house, it's all quite magnificent. That whole sequence at Pemberley is so important in terms of Elizabeth's view of Mr. Darcy and what begins to bring about the change in her feelings towards him. So I was surprised that in the movie there are no scenes at Pemberley whatsoever. Where it looks like much of the series is filmed inside actual rooms in old houses in England, the movie is a large-scale MGM film, so they spared no expense on the sets. They are truly grand and give a different feel than the series. The same goes for the costumes. The series is going for a more toned-down, period-appropriate style, especially concerning the women's dresses. The men's costumes don't look that much different between the two, at least to me. In the film, the women's costumes are pretty wild. These dresses are huge with seemingly miles of fabric covering everyone, and the hats. In the opening scene alone, we see quite the assortment of bonnets that shoot straight upward and wide striped hats flaring out to the sides. The costumes were by Adrian, a very well-known costume designer responsible for everything from The Wizard of Oz to Shadow of a Doubt. The set dressing for some of the exterior scenes in the film is also quite impressive. We have an outdoor party in May where the archery scene takes place, and the garden outside the Bennet's house is also quite decked out in terms of flowers. That garden shows up at the end, when Mr. Bingley and Jane are getting engaged, along with Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. And you contrast that with the scene in the series where Elizabeth finally admits her changed feelings while walking down a muddy road. The approach to the material in terms of what is seen as romantic and glamorous is very different. Both adaptations do a great job with the scene earlier where Mr. Darcy reluctantly tells Elizabeth of his feelings and all his hesitation about them. The 1940 film gives Greer Garson a chance to play up the more forceful aspect of Elizabeth. In the series, it really seems as though there is no chance of reconciliation between the two, which is good because it's at exactly the halfway point, giving hours for them to come around and begin to understand one another. That whole scene did remind me of a very similar sequence in the 2004 miniseries North and South. I'm assuming fans of Pride and Prejudice are already well aware of North and South, but if you have not seen it, I'd highly recommend it. The entire Mr. Wickham storyline is far more important in the series than the movie. Again, in the movie it is still crucial, but the series shows this whole unfortunate event as being devastating to the family, and it shows a different, very determined side to Mr. Darcy. I'm going to admit a prediction, maybe more of a hope that I had while watching the miniseries. As soon as Mr. Darcy left Elizabeth when she received the bad news about Lydia, I was convinced I knew where this was going. Not that long before, we saw Mr. Darcy doing some fencing, and doing quite a good job of it. So when he took off, I thought, okay, here we go. Mr. Darcy is going to hunt down Mr. Wickham in the streets of London, find him, and challenge him to a duel. Mr. Wickham is a soldier, he would have training with a sword as well. We would then get the satisfaction of Mr. Darcy defeating Wickham in an intense fight, ending with Wickham being run through with a saber. Lydia can then return to her family, the family's honor has been saved, and no more innocent young ladies can be preyed upon. But I forgot Mr. Darcy is rich, with plenty of funds to pay off debts and cads such as Mr. Wickham. There is a key difference as well concerning the character of Lady Catherine in regards to the end of the story. In the series, she confronts Elizabeth about Mr. Darcy, her nephew, out of real concern that he could end up married to a quote-unquote poor girl such as Elizabeth. In the movie, I was very surprised when it's pointed out that the confrontation is all part of a scheme to see if Elizabeth is just interested in Darcy for his money. That plays into the movie feeling more like a comedy, as a situation like that would not be out of place in a screwball comedy from the period about love interests from different classes. So, which is better? I'm going to have to say the miniseries. The extended runtime only helps the story, and it never dragged whatsoever for me. The characters are so well drawn, wonderful performances all around, it's very well written, and the location photography is gorgeous. But the movie is also very well made. It's an extremely fast-paced version of the story, and condensing it works in most cases. They even managed to basically work the title into the dialogue at one point, which I thought was funny. The sets are amazing, the costumes have to be seen to be believed, and the movie deservedly won an Oscar for Best Art Direction. So I'd highly recommend both. And there is still the 2005 film and another miniseries that originally aired in 1980. So if I feel like stepping back into the world of Pride and Prejudice, there is plenty more where this came from. Thanks so much for checking out this joint review. If you enjoyed it, please check out some more of my reviews over on Hildebrand Productions. And hey, let me know which is your favorite Pride and Prejudice adaptation and what other filmed versions of Jane Austen are worth checking out. Thanks again, and adios for now.